Hello and welcome to iCatholic. I'm Wendy Grace. Well, it is hard to ignore the impacts of climate change. We can see it all around us in the news headlines. And something that we have to really work hard on, I think, as Catholics is how does our faith intertwine with our challenge of looking after the planet and looking after the people that live on this planet. And join with me to discuss this, because we are in the season of creation, I have Jane Mellet of Tròcaire. Jane, this is what you're eating, sleeping and breathing at the moment in terms of the season of creation, and you're connecting all that up with Pope Francis's encyclical Laudato Si. But how does that play out just in parishes and everyday life?
Yeah, Wendy, so we're in the season of creation, which runs from the 1st of September to the 4th of October, the Feast of St. Francis of Assisi. And it's an ecumenical season, so potentially we have over 2 billion Christians around the world invited to pray, reflect and take action in terms of what's happening to our world at the moment and the ecological crises we're facing. So here in Ireland, we are really busy with outreach across parishes. There's lots of Laudato Si volunteers and Care for Creation groups who are running fantastic events around the country, using a lot of the resources provided for them by the Irish Bishops' Conference and by Tròcaire. So just yesterday I was at a creation hour in Mount Merion Parish in Dublin, and they just had an hour of music, reflection, poetry, suggestions for action in relation to climate justice in particular. Other parishes have created beautiful sacred spaces. They're encouraging people to get involved in tree planting, biodiversity projects, raising awareness, screening the letter film. So there's lots of activities going on around the place, and I think this year we've noticed a bit of a tipping point in terms of activities. So there's so many parishes are celebrating the season of creation this year around the country. It's a big increase. So it's great in terms of awareness of the season is growing, and that's helping to create awareness on the ground of the reality of what's happening to our common home and how faith communities might try to be involved in protecting creation a bit more.
And is that something that we need to, I guess, rise up to the challenge more, especially as people of faith? Because ultimately, when we're looking at what's happening in the world, as Pope Francis talks about all the time, is that it is generally those, the poorest of the poor, who are disproportionately impacted by our consumerism, our actions. Obviously, we've seen just extreme weather events happening across the globe and such loss of life and devastation. So people can, on the one hand, feel overwhelmed or abdicate responsibility because you could understand how someone might feel, well, I can't, it's gone too far, I can't make a difference. What do you say to that?
Yeah, it's huge. It's such an overwhelming issue, and the most natural response is to stick our heads in the sand, because we think, well, there's nothing I can do about that. So on one level, we need to remember that there's an urgent need for a shift in public policy at the level of government and international agreements and so on. And I think as voters, we have to push for that. So that's one thing we must do. And we can do that as parish communities coming together as well. But there's another piece of this as well, which is to do with our, I suppose, personal relationship with God's creation. So yes, there's the big picture. It's like the think global, act local. We're back to that. But this is, how am I in harmony with God's creation? And that's looking at our lifestyle choices and seeing what little changes we can make on a day-to-day basis. And I think that's living out the call of Laudato Si to care more deeply for our common home, not forgetting that these major decisions have to urgently be made by our governments, and that at any opportunity we get to talk to our local politicians, that we put that on the agenda. There's no denying, after the summer we've had, that the impacts of this are affecting the poorest people in our world the most. But we saw this summer that climate change is now affecting every region, from Canada to Hawaii, the soaring temperatures across Europe. So for the season of creation this year, Pope Francis he calls for three things. He calls for a conversion of our own hearts. He calls for a change in lifestyle for every individual, But he also calls on a shift in public policy, and he directly addresses COP28, which is coming up in November, December.
So what's that all about, Jane?
So, yeah, the COP, it's Conference of Parties, it's the UN Climate Convention. It's COP28 because it's the 28th year they are meeting to talk about this. And it's at this convention that the famous Paris Agreement came about. So it's where international leaders meet and they make agreements on how to move forward in terms of policy, particularly in relation to fossil fuels. So the urgency of this now cannot be denied, and I suppose we've seen in the past particular countries blocking the movement of these agreements. So Pope Francis calls this out in his message for the season of creation this year. He urges these world leaders to listen to the science and to urgently take action to replace fossil fuels with renewables. He makes that statement because of the suffering the continued use of fossil fuel infrastructure is now causing around the world. So it's quite a prophetic statement from Pope Francis, and other faith leaders coming together as well to call for the same actions. So that's November, December in Dubai, COP28, and he asks parishes and individuals to pray for COP28. He's like, we need to pray about this as well as take action. So that's another thing that we can do.
In a way, probably some parishes aren't dissimilar to people's houses, where you have people that are living in older homes, you've big old churches that, you know, we're trying to heat, light, all those sorts of things, where it can seem prohibitive to try and make it, say, more of an eco parish or an eco home. What's the in between? Like, what can people do that say, well, I don't have thousands to spend on retrofitting my home or my church? What do we do in the absence of that that'll still make a difference?
Yeah, there are some community grants available for parish buildings, like parish centres, parochial houses and so on. So it is worth looking into that, but they're the big jobs. I think an immediate starting point is to consider signing up for the Eco Parish Awards. And this is kind of an incremental award where you do little bits and you achieve step by step, very practical guidelines on that. But just a really positive development this year was that the Irish bishops asked that every parish in the country would consider returning 30% of church grounds to nature, so to increase biodiversity around the church grounds. And we've created a huge bank of resources in conjunction with the National Biodiversity Data Centre that's now available on the new Care for Our Common Home page on the Irish Bishop's website. So I'd really encourage people to go there and to look at that webpage. We've called it Return to Nature, and it's a great opportunity to invite in the local experts.
And bring communities together.
Exactly, yeah, your tidy towns committees, your local biodiversity officer, the experts are there. And
students from schools. Also,
huge potential. So that's really exciting, and we hope that will take off in the coming year. And it's a great sign of leadership from the Irish bishops. They're the first bishops' conference to make a statement like that, and there's huge interest in it. The National Biodiversity Data Centre were really pleased that this was happening, and they said this will make a difference to biodiversity locally, and they're happy to support people in the endeavour. So, you know, these are the good news stories, and we need good news, and it is back to that, you know, think global, act local cliche, but it's the truth, because the hope is in the action.
Finally, Jane, though, do we also need to bring it back to joining the dots to the reality that if you are a person of faith, you know, the commandment to love your neighbour, this is a way that we have to fulfill it by looking after the planet God has given us and the people that are in it. I think sometimes people don't make that connection, that to care for our planet, to care for the people that are in it couldn't be more Christian.
Of course, yeah. Like the first commandment we were given in Genesis, till and keep the garden of the Lord, and we're not doing such a great job of that. So we need to get moving, and that love of neighbour in the Gospels, like it has to now include questions around ecological justice, because our brothers and sisters who are the most vulnerable in the world are suffering the impacts of this crisis, and they've done the least to cause it, and we see that in Tròcaire every day. So working for climate justice is gospel imperative as far as I'm concerned, and Pope Francis says the same to us in Laudato Si, really calling us to this awakening, this movement of the heart, what he calls an ecological conversion.
Yeah, thank you so much, Shane, and I think a lot of people will be encouraged by just some of the practical examples you've given, but also awakened again to the urgency of the climate crisis. Thanks for joining us on iCatholic today.
It's a pleasure. Thank you so much.